Welcome, and thank you for joining today's webinar on the What Works Clearinghouse Practice Guide on using technology to support post-secondary student learning. My name is Sarah Costello, and I am a Senior Associate at Abt Associates. I am also the Project Director of the What Works Clearinghouse Post-Secondary Education and Post-Secondary Preparation Evidence Reporting, or WWC Pepper contract, which is funded by the IES. Today, I am joined by three of the expert panelists who developed the practice guide. Dr. Neda Dabah is a professor and director of the Division of Learning Technologies in the College of Education and Human Development at George Mason University. Dr. M.J. Bishop is Associate Vice Chancellor and Director of the William E. Kerwin Center for Academic Innovation at the University System of Maryland. And Dr. Anthony Picciano is a Professor of Urban Education, Education Leadership, and Interactive Pedagogy and Technology at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Neda and Tony bring perspectives as course instructors at higher education institutions serving diverse student populations, while MJ will share some system-level perspectives. We will provide a brief overview of the practice guide and then walk through each of the recommendations. Neda, MJ, and Tony will provide strategies for implementing each of the recommendations. It is important to remember these evidence-based recommendations require thoughtful planning and resources to implement effectively. Some of the strategies shared today can be applied during the emergency remote teaching mode that post-secondary institutions are currently navigating during the COVID-19 global health crisis. But several of these strategies can also be applied by institutions who are facing longer-term decisions about using technology to support post-secondary teaching and learning. If you have questions about the individual recommendations, please use the chat function to post them. We will do our best to get to the questions at the end. This webinar will be recorded. The What Works Clearinghouse provides an online repository of high-quality evidence generated by systematic reviews of existing research. The WWC's flagship products that summarize findings from these reviews are intervention reports and practice guides. Practice guides provide sets of recommendations for educators and administrators to address challenges in their classrooms and schools. There are nearly 30 practice guides available on the WWC website, covering a range of topics relevant to K-12 and post-secondary teaching and learning. This practice guide focuses on 5 evidence-based recommendations around how to use technology to support post-secondary learning. Recommendations are actionable statements for practitioners. Each recommendation in the practice guide includes examples of technologies and how to implement them, advice on how to overcome potential obstacles, and a summary of the research evidence that supports the recommendation. The recommendations were developed by the expert panel using information generated by the WWC team's systematic evidence review. The WWC team screened over 3,800 studies and reviewed 282 studies against the WWC's rigorous standards for high-quality evidence. 29 of those studies met WWC standards. The practice guide findings reflect the intersection of the expert panel's professional opinion on best education practice and evidence gleaned from the 29 studies that met the WWC standards. The target audience for the practice guide includes higher education instructors, instructional designers, administrators, and other staff seeking ways to support instructional practices and student learning with technology. The types of technology and post-secondary settings covered by the practice guide are defined broadly. The panel emphasized the importance of the following overarching themes. Focus on how technology is used, not the technology itself. Technology evolves rapidly, and recommending specific technologies will make the practice guide outdated fast. Align technology to learning goals. Practitioners should focus not on the mechanical use of technology, but how to use the technology to better engage students in achieving learning goals. Pay attention to potential issues of accessibility. Computer, tablet, and smartphone ownership is not universal, and some students, especially those in rural areas, have spotty or non-existent internet access. Students with special needs or disabilities can sometimes find it difficult to use or interact effectively with technology. Finally, technology deployments may require significant investment and coordination. Implementing any new intervention takes training and support. Effective implementation of new technologies requires support from administrators and teaching and learning centers. The expert panel's first recommendation is to use communication and collaboration tools to increase interaction among students and between students and instructors. When used effectively, communication and collaboration tools can increase engagement by allowing students to communicate about course content and their learning experiences. You can find implementation tips and sample tools, like the one shown on this slide, in the practice guide. Nada, how does this recommendation apply as we make the pivot from emergency remote teaching to the development of higher quality online learning experiences? And what specific strategies would you suggest?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My first strategy for implementing this recommendation is to choose communication and collaboration technologies that align with the learning activities that you have planned for your course and also aligning with your teaching approach or your teaching style. Keeping in mind the 4 different types of learning interactions that can happen with technology, and these would be learner-content interactions, learner-instructor interactions, learner-learner interactions, and learner-group interactions. All these types of interactions can be fostered or facilitated using communication and collaboration tools. For example, if your teaching approach or style is project-based learning or problem-based learning or experiential learning, which means that you usually engage your students in a lot of collaborative activities and teamwork, you will need to use more synchronous communication tools to allow students to work remotely in small groups to complete projects or assignments. So in this case, the focus is on learner group interactions. Examples of communication and collaboration tools that support learner group interactions include platforms like Zoom or WebEx, which is the platform that we're using right now, or Google Hangouts, or other video conferencing technologies that allow screen sharing, use of whiteboards, or breakout rooms. Now, if the learning activities that you typically engage your students in are more content-driven or content-focused, and the learning outcomes focus more on comprehension and understanding, then asynchronous communication and collaboration tools would be more appropriate in this case. For example, threaded discussions, the use of blogs and voice threads, which are audiovisual asynchronous communication technologies. And the reason why these would be appropriate communication and collaboration tools in this case is that discussions, blogs, and voice threads allow students to verbalize, to articulate their understanding of the content at their own pace and their own time, and it allows them to engage in dialogue with other learners. So the interaction is more focused here on learner-to-learner interaction. The practice guide has specific protocols on how to structure online discussions and blog posts and when to use blogs versus online discussions. And finally, if your course or pedagogical approach supports both types of learning activities or teaching styles, so which means that you do include collaborative and content-driven or content-focused learning activities, then my advice would be to use a combination of asynchronous and synchronous communication and collaboration tools in a complementary, intentional, and purposive manner to the extent possible. In other words, you don't want to repeat the same learning activity using synchronous and asynchronous technologies.
Thanks, Nada. MJ, is there anything else that you might want to add about this recommendation?
Hi, yes, thanks. So I think I would just build on what Nada was saying about the affordances of these tools. You know, during this time of emergency remote teaching, it's been a really good idea for us to keep things simple. We didn't have a lot of planning time. You know, basically thinking in terms of moving what we were currently doing into a remote teaching platform, utilizing this combination of asynchronous and synchronous. But as Nada was just suggesting, you know, there are pros and cons to both approaches. With asynchronous tools, for example, while that can allow students to respond at their own time, at their own pace, it can also be somewhat unpersonal, right? So you're not having a direct conversation with somebody. You're somewhat even more distanced by the time and space of the asynchronous tools, whereas synchronous tools allow us, as we are now, to engage in a conversation. With asynchronous tools, however, we've got students, as you said, Sarah, who are having difficulty connecting on the internet. They don't have access to the technologies they need in order to be in a session at a particular time of day. Asynchronous can really help a lot in those situations for those students. But at the same time, many of us are facing a lot of stress. This is an incredibly stressful situation. Having that mix and that opportunity to also engage synchronously from time to time, I think, is really important for our students in order for them to continue to feel connected. So I agree with Nada. I think striking that balance between the two to make sure, at least at this point, that we're both accommodating students that may have difficulty connecting at a particular place and time, but also helping them with, continuing to feel really connected to us as faculty is really important.
Great. Thanks, MJ. Recommendation 2 is to use varied, personalized, and readily available digital resources to design and deliver instructional content. The how-to steps for this recommendation, which you can find in the guide, focus on how to use technology to offer entire courses or large portions of courses through different formats, such as online, hybrid, or flipped models. This would require more time and planning than allowed in these times of emergency remote teaching. Tony, how does this recommendation apply to the development of higher quality online learning experiences, and what are some of the strategies that you might suggest?
Thank you, Sarah. Well, there's the old adage, variety is the spice of life. Well, variety is the spice in learning also. And I think that regardless of what modality you use, I would encourage instructors and faculty to figure out how to introduce different ways of their teaching. And I think in general, students will respond and be much more engaged with whatever it is you're doing. But it is important that instructors do not depend on any one delivery mechanism. And I think this is something that a lot of people who've been teaching online can fall into because they get very comfortable with it. We know that in the face-to-face classroom that a lot of faculty will do their lecture, and they've been doing the same lecture for a number of years. And they may have some other activities, but the same is true, I think, in the online mode. For people who've been teaching online for a while, they can fall into some comfort zone. And I would strongly recommend that faculty, whether you're experienced or new to online learning, that they consider varying what they do and how they do it. The online environment also provides lots of opportunities for us to gracefully use lots of different technological tools. We can use media, we can use text, we can use simulations. 20 years ago, this was not possible. The bandwidth wasn't there for most of us who were teaching online, but now it is, and it's actually very, very dependable and reliable. And most, not all of our students, and I appreciate what was said earlier, but most of our students do have access to the technology, but not all. And I think that we need to keep that in mind as we develop our activities. The bottom line in choosing these tools relates to our pedagogical objectives and applying the right tool to meet them. This was mentioned earlier, and I'll probably say it again before this session is over because I tend to repeat myself, but you need to have the pedagogy to drive the technology and not the other way around. And I have to say that, again, in my experiences, I found too many colleagues who get really engaged with the technology, and then they start changing everything they're doing to the technology. I have a concern about that. I think you have to identify your pedagogical goals, the style of which you teach, and that might be different from one discipline to another, but I would strongly urge that if you're designing your online environment, that you identify what are your goals and then apply the right tool for that. Earlier, I think it was MJ mentioned that concern about access to technology for some of our students. I think related to this tool is being aware of who your students are. Now, I work at City University of New York, which is a very diverse institution. We have a lot of, let's say, students whose first language is not English. For them, I have found that using text-based activities is very, very beneficial. The reason being is that in a regular class or even in a synchronous video conferencing environment, that some of these students don't process the language quickly enough, and so that they are sometimes missing points of whatever the instructor is making. In addition, they might have difficulty responding to questions because by the time they figured out what was being presented, the instructor has moved on to the next part of the lesson. In the asynchronous environment, what I have found is that this provides, and again, you can have it so that students have days to respond depending upon who your population is. But I have found that students whose language is different than English for their first language, I have found that they kind of appreciate the fact that they can read a posting of some sort. And if they don't get it, they can read it again. If they still don't get it, they can still read it again. And then they can take the time to develop some text to respond to that posting. And I have found, and I've had feedback both from faculty who teach these populations as well as the students themselves, that they appreciate the asynchronous aspect of teaching online, of learning online, mainly because it gives them the time to understand what is being presented. By the same token, I do think that, for instance, if we look at synchronous communications, video conferencing, such as what we're doing now, there's a certain joy in being in the moment with your students. You can see them, you can see their faces, you can make comments about the hats they're wearing. All those kinds of very deep personal connections are very valuable in a synchronous video conferencing environment. So my sense, and I believe in this strongly, is that you should vary your instruction, use different tools. The internet of 2020 is not the internet of 2001, and all these tools are available. They're relatively reliable, and they are much easier to use. And then my last comment on this, which I think someone else mentioned earlier, maybe Sarah, that you really have to know what your students, what's their access to technology. And in some of our schools, it is much more widespread than others. And I know that here at City University, something like 10% of our students do not necessarily have access to technology. Either they don't have the equipment or they do not have the Wi-Fi connection. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. MJ, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
I agree. Once again, I guess it's no surprise with much of what Tony has suggested. I guess what I would add is, as we're starting to think about potentially having to make a pivot from what we've been doing this spring semester into the summer, and God forbid we have to start thinking about this even for the fall, I would agree with Tony that, we need to be certain that the technology isn't driving technology isn't driving our pedagogy. We need to assuming that we're going to be able to be a little more planful moving ahead, we want to be sure that we're revisiting our learning objectives, thinking hard about what the key outcomes of the course are, and thinking about, and this is one of the big differences between remote teaching and what I would call online education, thinking about the kind of resources and information that need to be front-loaded in the course so that students can be successful. Using varied, personalized, and readily available digital resources is one of those things that we can do to address a variety of the learner needs that Tony was talking about earlier with respect to ESL students, with respect to students that have limited access to synchronous technologies, all those kinds of things. That's one big part of this. I think, too, another thing that we could be thinking about, one of the things we lose, and this gets back to the affordances or lack of affordances in this case, of what it is to be teaching remotely like this, we lose an awful lot of the social cues that we're used to when we're in a face-to-face environment. So if I'm teaching in front of a class, I'm able to see when students look confused. I'm able to gauge that, only one or two students each time I ask a question is raising their hand, and start to get a sense of the fact that I'm leaving my class behind. and then I do some checks for understanding and try to kind of circle back on the content that they may be missing. We don't have that opportunity when we move to remote teaching like this. We miss out on all those social cues. There are technologies now like courseware and other platforms that provide us with analytics that allow us to see how our students are moving through content in a much more nuanced way than has been available even 5 to 10 years ago. If we end up having to pursue this longer, or for those who are interested in understanding more about what does it really mean to be teaching online, or helping to create an truly online learning environment. I think exploring some of those kinds of tools moving forward is going to be really important to ensure high quality and really successful environment for students to learn.
Thanks, MJ. Nada, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Sure, I'll be quick. I would like to add to this recommendation about personalized, how do you use technology to provide personalized learning. This new generation learning environment, what we call a personal learning environment, or the idea is to help students or allow them to develop their own personal digital learning spaces using technology, or what we call a PLE, or a personal learning environment, so that they can gather their own learning resources, they can connect with peers on their own terms, and they can connect to learning communities beyond the course context. So this type of approach empowers students to use their preferred technologies, such as social media technologies, to take ownership of the learning process and become proactive and engaged learners.
Thanks, Nada. The third evidence-based recommendation from the expert panel is to incorporate technology that models and fosters self-regulated learning strategies. Effective learning depends on knowing how to learn and to manage one's own learning processes. Some students gain these skills prior to enrolling in college, but many do not. Online and blended learning environments can require extra levels of self-direction, organization, and planning from the student. Nada, what specific strategies would you suggest for implementing recommendation 3?
So thanks, Sarah. This is a really sort of a near and dear topic for me, because I do a lot of research related to how can we use technology to support self-regulated learning. So I'm going to start with advising the use of technologies that we can use as scaffolds to help students apply self-regulated learning strategies, particularly as this relates to goal setting and to time planning and management. So if you're using an LMS, for example, a learning management system, I'm going to say use the announcement feature, which is a communication and collaboration tool. Use it frequently, use it consistently, and use it effectively to send what we call nudge messages, such as reminders and prompts. Such messages are already being built into adaptive learning systems or adaptive learning software and into smartphone apps, so they have become mostly autonomous, meaning that they're generated by the data traces that our students leave as they interact with learning technologies that track such data. For example, learning management systems can be programmed to automatically send nudges and prompts to students who are not on track in terms of turning in assignments or participating in online discussions. So they're sort of, missing in action for a few days. And we have the technology nowadays to trace such students and to also send automated nudges and prompts to try to help keep them on track. What I'm doing in my online courses currently is I am sending out an announcement on the same day each week to remind students about the learning activities and the assignments that are due during that week. These announcements that I'm sending out are clear, they're concise, and they set expectations for the entire week. So it's a good idea to structure your courses into weekly modules and to send weekly announcements to your students on the same day each week to help students set appropriate learning goals for the week and to help them manage their time effectively. Now, you can also do this via email as well, not necessarily just through announcements of your learning management system announcement feature. And sometimes you might need to do this on a student-by-student basis. So when you notice that a student has not participated in a learning activity, you can also use chat features to nudge students if you have set up a chat room for your course using a mobile app. Students in this day and age really appreciate getting these short nudges or prompts on their mobile phones or tablets rather than receiving them via email. So for example, some mobile apps provide students with access to information about assignments, access to campus resources and supports, and availability of course materials. These tools can also be used to track students' progress towards goals, such as on-time attendance. And finally, another strategy that I would like to recommend here that would support self-regulated learning and how can we use technology to foster self-regulated learning is to provide rubrics through content creation tools as guidelines for assignments. Rubrics are great because they help students better understand how they will be graded on an assignment so that they can prepare accordingly and effectively. And you can find more information about these scaffolding strategies and technologies for supporting self-regulated learning in the practice guide.
Thanks, Netta. MJ, is there anything else that you wanted to add about supporting students' self-regulated learning strategies? Oh, I'm not seeing MJ on the line. I know we're having a big windstorm here up the East Coast, so maybe when she joins again, I'll go to her. But for now, Tony, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Yes, I think Nada laid out a nice plan for where we're heading with our technology. I would add that in the not too distant future, I think we're going to see a lot more self-regulated adaptive learning software. My sense is that there's a lot of investment going into this area, and this is definitely, this comment is strictly for those who are thinking about longer term, how to plan for the next, the next year or so. I do believe, and I think I need to say this because I haven't heard it yet, is that a lot of what's going on as online learning with emergency remote teaching is not really the online model that I think Nada and MJ and I have been talking about. I come from an environment where we set out very carefully what we want to do and then apply the right technological tools. I mean, it will take me a good part of a summer to design a new course that is maybe fully online and will likely blended. I happen to work in a university where most of my students in New York City are a subway or a bus stop away, and so it's not geographical distance for them to get to a course at Hunter College or the Graduate Center, but for them it's an issue of time. So my sense is that we can use a lot of the technology that will ease that, but I see us moving towards an adaptive learning model. I think in the years to come, we will see a lot more adaptive learning software that will integrate some artificial intelligence into it. And the artificial intelligence, I still think, is in its early stages, but in the years to come, it will become much more prolific.
Thanks, Tony. Recommendation 4 is to use technology to provide timely and targeted feedback on student performance. Technology permits rapid assessment and tabulation of students' responses and can be used both in and outside of class. Technology provides opportunities for students to engage with content and demonstrate their understanding, or lack of understanding, to themselves and to their instructor at the time that learning activities occur. Tony, how does this recommendation apply when you think about these times of the emergency remote teaching?
Well, again, the use of timely feedback is important regardless of whether you're using technology or not. And I'll also make a comment here that a lot of the basic course design and instructional design strategies that we've used for years, whether we were doing it online or not, they overlap. They overlap a lot, and particularly if we look at the blended model, which is probably the most prolific model that exists in our country, although we have no data on it because the definitions make it very difficult as an area of study. But it is very easy to combine combinations of online and face-to-face assessment activities to judge how students are progressing through a course. I would also say that the online environment, though, is very graceful in providing immediate feedback, whether it's quizzes, tests, even essays and presentations. I think that the online environment provides lots of opportunities for students to get very, very quick and accurate feedback. Nada was mentioning early in terms of personalized learning. I think one of the really big benefits of personalized learning is there's almost regular, constant feedback to the student as to how they are doing. And I think this is a technological tool that we really didn't have at our disposal prior to the advances in online learning. So yes, it's important that the students understand where they stand in a course, and the more you can do it, the better off they are, and to some degree better off you are. I would also like to mention, and this may be for those who are specifically interested in what we have to say in terms of emergency remote teaching, that a lot of our colleges, if you've noticed, have done away with the grading system and have moved to pass-fail or credit non-credit. I think this was a good decision. I know we've done this at my institution, but a lot of other institutions have done the same thing, and that really applies to that a lot of the switch from what might have been a face-to-face course to an online course or remote learning course was done on the fly very quickly and by a lot of people who had never done it before. So I'll just mention that as an aside, but it's an important consideration as we move forward, particularly looking at what we do with the emergency remote teaching. The other thing that I like to use, and this is what I like to use, especially in the synchronous mode, is to provide as much feedback as I can through video. I like talking to the students. I like seeing their faces, and I think if you can do some of the feedback, not the entire course, but intersperse it as you think is key points in the semester, that this will be very, very beneficial to the students. And I think they like it. I think someone earlier, it might have been MJ, commented, the social interaction in the face-to-face environment, and I believe in that. But you can do a lot of that now through video conferencing, and I have found that the students appreciate seeing one another, I would like to say they like to see me, but at 72, 73 years old, that's probably not true anymore. But in any case, but I think it's important that you do provide constant feedback. Another technique I've used, which I found very helpful, particularly if I'm in a large section size, is that it may be difficult if you have to provide feedback, let's say on an essay, or even a large posting for each student, but you can engage with peer-to-peer evaluation. And I encourage that also. Again, it depends a little bit on the maturity level of your students, but I know in my graduate courses I do that a lot, particularly if there's a large enrollment. Rather than me having to respond to each student as to how particularly well a posting went, I'll have students respond to students. And I like the idea that the interaction, going back to recommendation 1, is going more student to student and not everything going student to the faculty member. So I would offer that as a very, very good suggestion, particularly if you're in a large section size. I think that's about it at this point in time, and I'll pass it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Tony. MJ, is there anything else that you wanted to add about recommendation 4?
Sure, yeah. Can you hear me, Sarah?
Yes. Welcome back.
Great. Thank you. Little power outage here in Maryland. So, yeah, as I've been thinking about this recommendation, and I do think when we were talking about it back when we were working on this project, we were thinking in terms of, feedback to students. But I think we're going to also, in these unusual circumstances, need to be thinking about feedback for our own purposes as well. whether we're teaching online or face-to-face in the fall, having gone through this spring semester of very unusual circumstances as we have, I think we're going to want to be thinking hard about building in some diagnostic assessments at the beginning of our courses in the fall. MJ had Chem 1 this spring, and she's moving into Chem 2 in the fall semester. It's going to be important for us to understand, how many concepts did MJ really get, and if she's missed a few, we don't want to make this a high stakes assessment. This isn't, whether or not MJ gets to go on into Chem 2. We've already decided she's passed that course and gotten the grade, but we want to understand, are there things we're going to have to build into Chem 2 in order to remediate some of the things that the majority of our students don't get this semester, and look at ways that diagnostic assessments can inform and provide feedback for what our course needs to look like in the fall. So I've started thinking about this recommendation also in terms of the timely feedback to faculty on student performance and the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of restructuring our fall courses in order to remediate some of the things that got missed this spring.
Thanks, MJ. So the final recommendation in the practice guide is to use simulation technologies that help students engage in complex problem solving. Technologies that simulate complex problems can mitigate the time and place constraints of traditional case studies or field projects. They also provide students with the opportunity to work through challenging situations, and these technologies can allow students to take multiple approaches to solving a problem and help them understand the implications of the approach that they decide to take by simulating different consequences. MJ, how would you say this recommendation applies as we're making the pivot from the emergency remote teaching to the development of the higher quality online learning experiences for students?
Yeah, and I know when we were preparing for this webinar, we were wrestling with, is this one that's just too difficult to implement during this emergency remote teaching period that we're in now? But I really like this recommendation for a variety of reasons. When simulations, and of course, I think in these technologies, we're talking about a wide range of things that go at one end, from very technical and, lots of opportunities for students to manipulate things in order to see what the effects that the things they do have on the outcomes of the simulation. All the way, from that very technical side to, simulations. There are things that we could call simulations that are a lot less technical, like providing a teacher ed student with a couple of videos of student behavior in the classroom and allowing them the opportunity to address a series of questions about how they would respond in that situation, and or what's better, the way the teacher responded in use case A versus use case B, which is a fairly low tech simulation, if you will. I'm using my air quotes in that case. These things really provide opportunities for us to engage our students in much more authentic activities. It gets us past feeling like, when we're doing this from a distance, that we have to rely solely on multiple choice items and, fairly straightforward knowledge assessments. It allows us to move up into assessments of higher order skills in ways that I think are really important, whether we're doing remote teaching or we're looking beyond into, what's next for, online education as well. The other thing I think that these simulations can do, and a big concern that we have as we're thinking about online education, I know it's true here with the institutions in Maryland, is how are we going to guarantee academic integrity as we move into the end of the spring semester for exams. Simulations like these can allow us to think differently about the way we're doing our assessments and create environments in which it actually starts to become very difficult to cheat, because what we're asking students to do is to provide their own evaluation of a particular context and give us some kind of a written response to a prompt about what's happening in their environment. So I think simulations can be really important in these contexts, both in terms of creating that authentic learning opportunity, allowing us to assess at higher order skills, and also address some of the concerns that we have about academic integrity. The tough thing about this, though, of course, again, as we said earlier in this session, we had minimal opportunities to plan. We've really just been doing the best we can with the resources we have. So, I do think this is a recommendation that starts that pivot toward next steps, because it's going to be important for instructors and instructional designers to again, go back to our learning objectives, understand exactly what types of simulation technologies are available to cover those objectives and the subject matter. Think about the amount of class or instructional time that's going to be necessary to implement that simulation, and then determine whether there's going to be a lot of training involved, either for the instructors or for the students, in order to guide their use of it. So I like this recommendation. It is a little further along in terms of that pivot towards online instruction, but I think it can be applicable even now as we're beginning to think about, how are we going to redesign our assessments this spring semester in order to ensure rigor, but also academic integrity. If I may, Sarah, can I add one other quick thing?
Yes.
As we're, we've been talking a lot about, and it's not just specific to this recommendation, we've been talking a lot among ourselves as we've been preparing for this about some of the positives that may be coming out of this massive emergency remote teaching phase that we've been experiencing. I'm seeing across our system a lot of first of all, a lot of faculty, they're working very, very, very hard to make this Herculean lift, including an awful lot of folks who I think never envisioned themselves doing this online teaching thing. They're becoming somewhat more open to using technology to support academic innovation. We're getting a lot of great, thoughtful questions from faculty about how they can pare things down and stay focused on their instructional goals so as not to overwhelm their students. They are asking those questions about academic integrity in remote learning formats, which has been something that we've been hoping to guide faculty toward. They're really becoming very interested in understanding the technologies that can support their learning objectives. So while, there's some silver linings. While as horrible as this has been for so many people, there are some silver linings in what we're experiencing now. And I hope that we're going to be able to keep those conversations going as we look forward to summer and fall, and whatever happens next, whether we're online or hopefully get back together face to face.
Right. Yep. Thanks, MJ. Go ahead, Nada.
So I wanted to add to what MJ just said, that also at George Mason University, we're considering what kinds of resources should we be, getting to help faculty adjust to these new teaching modalities, if you will, and thinking about what we might do for the fall. We already have teams of instructional designers actually working with faculty and faculty leads to help them understand better how to use this technology, and a lot of it is based on the recommendations that we have provided in this practice guide. So I think, as MJ mentioned, our faculty are doing the best they can in a very short period of time, but we are also, as an institution, sort of trying to see what is the best process going ahead and what types of online development courses might we offer our faculty, and how can we give them support in terms of better understanding how to use the technology. And one other thing I would add to what Tony said about, we've all changed our grading at the end of the semester now. students will be able to select whether they want to stick with the ABC grading scale, if you will, or go to a pass-fail, or go to even a non-credit. Each university is doing it differently, and that gives students a lot of, leeway in these stressful times, because they may not be able or have been able to spend the time necessary to succeed fully in their courses. So these are other adjustments that we are all doing at the institution level to help us and to help faculty get through this and to help students get through this. But it is sort of a really nice time now as well, or a good time, to collect as much data as we can about what's happening and consider this as sort of a design experiment, if you will, and how does this work in this emergency remote teaching, and then eventually going into the fall where we may also have to be online, we're not sure of that. That's it. Thank you.
Can I make a couple of quick comments there, Sarah? Do we have time for this?
Yep, and then we're going to turn it over to some of the questions that have been coming in the chat. Go ahead, Tony.
I'll be quick. First, going back to what MJ's comments about simulations, I'm a big fan of simulations, and have been involved in, years back in designing some software for astronomy courses, which I enjoyed a lot. I have no background in astronomy, but I enjoyed helping a couple of my colleagues in the physics program design some courses. And I think simulations, if in terms of any science that anyone might be teaching, we really should be using simulation software. And it might be true of some other disciplines. Some of it is readily available, some of it is expensive, but I do think that a lot of our colleagues in the sciences should really consider using some of the simulation software that's available. On the other hand, I teach in ed leadership, and I've been using case study methodology for years, and that's a form of simulation. Students are put in the position of being a principal or an assistant principal in a school, and then they have to try and figure out some aspect of whatever the theme is of the case study. That could be done, that's low-tech and easily implemented. And in any of the professional programs, whether it's business, health sciences, education, law, I think that case study methodology, which is a really, really good form of simulation, can be implemented. The other thing I just want to make one little comment. I agree fully with Nada and MJ regarding planning for the coming fall semester and beyond. One of my great concerns is that I'm not sure if the colleges and universities are geared up on the instructional design end, that is, having enough instructional design personnel to assist a lot of faculty who might have been turned on a bit because they were forced to do it as part of the emergency remote teaching. So I'm a little concerned about that, and I'm very curious to see how the colleges will respond to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. So as our panelists were walking us through each of the recommendations in the practice guide, participants were posting some great questions in the chat box. We'll see how many we can get through in the time that's remaining. So thinking back to recommendation one of the first questions that came in is, at my institution, some of the instructors who initially set up meetings synchronously are finding that students are not showing up. Relatedly, how do you manage when students working online neglect reading instructions and they don't do their pre-assignment work, such as readings or watch a lecture before doing the assignment? Tony or Nada, do one of you guys want to jump in and take that one?
Well, I'll make a quick comment on the first part of that question. I think we've spoken a lot about, and I would chime in with some of my colleagues who've congratulated lots of faculty who have kind of all of a sudden, like in some cases days or a week, convert their courses from face-to-face to online, some of who had never taught online before, and I give them a lot of kudos. I think they did a wonderful job in mass. But a lot of our students also had to make a major adjustment, some of whom could and some of whom couldn't. And I'll give you one example. I teach in ed leadership and urban education. I have a group of students, almost all of whom teach in the New York City schools. They were all forced to start teaching online also. And if you take a typical high school teacher in New York City, they may all of a sudden be teaching 5 courses online, and maybe different courses. to me, that's a tremendous burden. And they had to do it quick, on the fly, and I think are doing it best they can. And I would say that in this time of global stress, I think we need to be aware of how our students are doing. I mean, they are not, teenagers. Many of them are adults with jobs, or maybe no longer have jobs. They are parents, and they may be under very stressful situations themselves. So I think we have to be attuned to that. And I must say, I've had a number of students who, I was teaching, the course I'm teaching now, which is fully online, it was blended, so it wasn't a big lift for me to move from a blended environment to a fully online environment. But I've had some wonderful students who, straight A students, who've emailed me and said, hey, Dr. P, I'm not able to participate this week because I'm just swamped at work. So I think we need to be sensitive of what's happening with our students. The other piece of this is, I don't know that all of our colleges were careful to understand what was the access to technology on the part of a lot of our students. And I think we've already made the point that, some rural areas do not have connectivity, but we have, in our urban areas, a lot of poor students who just don't have the technology.
So this is Ned. I'll just be brief because I know we want to get to more questions, but I will answer this question more from a pedagogical perspective. So, for example, if students are not showing up to your synchronous meeting, as I talked about earlier, these nudges or prompts, so if you have a chat room set up, or you could give them a prompt or a nudge as to, are they going to be on this meeting or not, and why. One other thing you can do is have them respond ahead of time that they have received your announcement, require responses from the students that, yes, we have received, that we understand that we have a synchronous meeting on this day and at this time, so require them to send you responses via email or via the platform that you're using. And the third thing, which kind of relates back to what MJ was saying about making our activities authentic, is give them a role. Give them a role in the online synchronous meeting. So, for example, ask them to present something, or require them to submit questions to you ahead of time, and then ask them to maybe reiterate the question in the meeting and have other learners address it, and then you can address it, or have them work in breakout rooms, in teams. So we need to make it authentic for them, and we need to engage them into learning by doing experiences, which hopefully will motivate them to be more engaged and more involved.
Thanks, Netta. MJ, I'm hoping maybe you can take this next question from a systems perspective. Someone wrote in and said, when you're thinking about planning for online education, what advice would you give for colleges who do not have a learning management system that's integrated into their database, right? So, and maybe it can't support the efficient transfer of course and student data. Do you have any thoughts or any insight on that, MJ?
I'm not a real expert on LMSs, but there are lots of other tools available. I suspect, certainly things like Google Docs and other, Dropbox, some of those other kinds of tools would be great places for faculty to be able to provide resources and learning materials to students, perhaps also over email, of course. But so the question that was getting at specifically at the integration between that and the SIS and the grading system, is that correct?
Yeah, sort of the LMS and being able to feed in that information to get this, because I think we were talking about being able to use data. I think it came up at that time in the conversation. But
right.
Thank you.
Right.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Can I ask you another question that I know you were speaking to earlier. Someone asked if you could give an example of a diagnostic assessment, like what you mentioned, MJ, about starting out the fall semester. Do you have any examples?
Yeah, and it sounds really technical, right? But it doesn't have to be. And actually, what we're talking about right now is trying to find ways to get faculty to collaborate on creating some openly licensed diagnostic assessments. This would essentially be, the opening quiz for a course that would just ask some basic questions around concepts that, in the second iteration of the course that you're going to be relying on building upon for like my example, Chem 2. So it doesn't have to be real complicated. It doesn't have to be, it should be a natural part of the class itself. But just really that, tries to get at, have students come away with, from course one that they took this spring with enough for you to build on? And if not, what are the things then I'm going to have to circle back and reteach, or at least remind them about at the beginning of the fall semester. So in fact, we've been talking exactly about that. Let's not make it real complicated. Let's make sure we're clear. It's not a high stakes exam. It's just intended to provide that information needed to make formative adjustments to the course.
Great, thanks. Nada, we had two questions that came in about the personalized learning environments. One person asked specifically about any examples, and another asked if there were any recommended platforms for hosting those personal learning environments. Do you have anything you might be able to share with us?
Sure. In terms of platforms, there's a platform called Evernote that many students have been using to sort of build their own resources, gather their own resources, prepare for assignments using Evernote. So that's one platform I would recommend. I'm not sure how integrative it is in terms of allowing the students to join learning communities within Evernote, but they may be able to do that outside of Evernote. Another very, very great platform that's more used in the corporate, if you will, and the organizational world more than the academic world would be a platform called Degreed. So this platform allows students or workers, if you will, in the workforce to set their own learning goals, and the platform actually curates resources and serves them up. It has like a recommender system and serves up the content for the employee to be able to perhaps earn a certificate about a specific skill that they need to master. So say they're working somewhere and they need to master, or they need to really learn better presentation skills or better communication skills, or maybe leadership skills. So there are platforms that allow the students to take charge of their learning, to put in their learning goals, and then be able to receive content. And the content doesn't have to be formal content. It could be a course on Coursera. It could be Udacity. It could be a certification or a micro-credentialing, or some type of system that allows them to earn stackable credentials in order to achieve their learning goals. And then with respect to K-12, there's also, I believe, a platform that some teachers have been using in their in K-12 environments. It's the name actually escapes me at the moment, but there are platforms, but that allow students to have their own dashboard and be able to, set their learning goals, gather information, gather the resources that they want in order to learn, and empowers them to take charge of their learning. So, but I would recommend that not to be sort of mired into one platform, unless you're doing it in an organizational context. So I really recommend that students sort of come up, with their own digital resources using regular social media technologies that they're comfortable in. It could be within a LinkedIn platform or even a Facebook platform or something similar that they're used to in order to support this personalized learning environment that I'm talking about.
Great. I have one last question for Tony. What advice might you have for faculty who are tempted to add more content, more assessments, more, because they assume that students have more time right now? Do you have any advice or suggestions for that approach?
Yes, I would say, I think someone said this earlier, in terms of, and you said in this time, so I mean, with the quick turnover, if that's what the person was thinking in terms of asking the question. First, I would say that if you had to be involved with a quick turnover from face-to-face to fully online, I think you should keep it as simple as possible. I don't know that you want to start making major expansions in the crossover. But if you've done it and you've been teaching online and you've gone through a couple of weeks and you're feeling good about it, and you sense your students are feeling good about it, I would definitely consider adding more content. And that would be challenging for the students, and I think it'd be challenging for the instructor. I would also say something which I mentioned earlier, that as you add more content, think about variety. Just don't add more reading assignments, but think about whether you can introduce some media if it's available. And, depending upon what you teach, there may be more media resources there than not. But I would think that, I would definitely consider adding more content. Whether you want to add more assessments, that's an entirely different issue. I mentioned earlier that a lot of our students are under stressful situations, depending upon your environment, and I'm feeling that from my students, but I wouldn't say I'm unique, but I may be different than some other schools in terms of what their students are doing, whether they're full-time employees or adults and what have you. But I think I would be careful about that at this point in time, unless it's a kind of informal assessment where the faculty member is going to meet in a video conference with them and go through with them in a very friendly face-to-face mode over the internet. But I would be careful about adding any heavy assessments at this time.
Thanks, Tony. Okay, so we're right at 4:30. Nada, MJ, and Tony, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. The Using Technology to Support Post-Secondary Student Learning Practice Guide can be accessed through the What Works Clearinghouse website. This webinar was recorded, and we will send out an email when the recording is available. To today's attendees, thanks for joining us, and thank you for all that you are doing to support post-secondary learning during these trying times. I hope everyone takes care and stays safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.